with both the educational policy of India as well as the work that Agastya has been doing all these years, we have an important role to play in what UNESCO itself states. All said and done, India is one of the largest countries in the world in terms of its population, its science, and its potential. And we are going to dominate in a good sense, the decades ahead. And therefore, it behooves us to take this seriously and weigh in on the matters at hand and make sure that we render to the people that be a set of perspectives that will allow them to formulate the policies that will in turn impact India. We owe a special responsibility to the future. And this UNESCO initiative is timely, and the NEP policy of India just published is quite a remarkable document as I went through it in recent days. And what Agastya has done is itself transformative. So what we're going to do in this discussion is to merge and meld all these three dimensions. One is, what is the UNESCO perspective on futures in education? Second, we're going to look at what is the NEP policy, what does it state, and what is the future ahead? And third, we're going to look at Agastya at the intersection of UNESCO's large-scale global ambitions and NEP's Indian ambitions, and see that intersection. In some ways, Agastya is playing ahead of the current state. Arguably, Agastya is 10 to 20 years ahead of the rest of the world in terms of the creativity and the kind of interaction that it has formulated and enabled. Now, I was looking at what has UNESCO done in this area, which is, how is it similar or dissimilar? And I'm going to use that as a framework to guide us along. Let's understand the present state, because we are in some sense unhappy with the present state that we navigate to a different future. So I'm going to call upon our younger generation.
So one thing actually I would like to start off with is more of a personal anecdote. So I often have my friends come and ask me for help with schoolwork, and I usually try my best to help them out with that. And one thing that I've learned through doing that is there is nothing that is impossible to learn. Sometimes, like, your approach may be wrong, the underlying knowledge that you need to be able to understand that concept may not be there yet, and you have to backtrack and fill in those holes. But most of the time, I feel like people give up too early, or they just keep going at it. It's like they keep running into a wall without taking a step back and realizing there's a door right next to them. I think the difference between hard work and smart work is not emphasized.
I was very curious to see your evolution, and you certainly are very passionate. So speak to your notion of learning out of school.
Okay. When I'm learning stuff, I'm not just, someone is not just blabbing the information. So I try to just discover it on my own before I look. So, for example, say I want to solve this math problem. So before someone telling me how to do it, I'll just think on my own for a few minutes, and then I most of the time I'll come up with a solution. So my mind is capable of doing that. It has the capacity, but that capacity is not getting utilized in this.
Right? So that would be very unfortunate. So in some ways, the magic of learning comes from self-discovery. And I think Sai's case illustrates that very clearly.
Students are not able to look at the bigger picture. When they come to the first year, they're into the highest chill zone because they came through a very rigorous process. And by the fourth year, their major goal becomes to get a placement. And in these 3 years, they just try their best to find what they love, and they end up liking something which pays most.
Are you finding joy in the learning process? Are you finding a process of discovery? And therefore, are you saying, my intellectual wealth is increasing?
So it depends on the two factors, basically. If I go through the administration or curriculum, no, I'm not enjoying. That I realized in my initial 2 cents that I'm not very much enthusiastic about engineering. But if you come to the other side where I meet these students, that's giving me a lot of joy. A lot of people who are very smart and interacting with them and like talking with the alums, that's giving me a huge space and I'm enjoying that.
Conceptual learning can be done sitting at home and just looking at online videos. But a practical approach to learning, actually, so when you go to the lab and design experiments, that is where your real understanding will be tested. So that is something
Beautiful.
that current education scenarios should try and look to promote.
But let's move now to the educators. As educators of the current state, you obviously have had huge number of students pass through you under your tutelage and under the tutelage of the system that you are part of. And you obviously are no stranger to these issues. But can you speak to the current system of learning as educators and look at the pros and cons of the current state?
So UNESCO is thinking about futures of education. So we have to take some models that were very successful. Somehow they have not sustained that the success that they had. And in India, we value education. Even in ancient times, we say Guru Devo Bhava. So Guru, teacher is like God. So we value. But then that value of education and teachers and so forth has changed now. Education has become a means for livelihood. There's nothing wrong with that as long as the spirit of education is maintained. And now it's for a job, and sometimes it's just for a degree. So you join education institution because you get a degree or a diploma that gives you livelihood. And in that process, the inquisitiveness and the curiosity and the innovative spirit, I think they're all getting eroded. I'm sure the situation is the same around the world, but it's definitely more so in India. So education has become a means to get a degree, and I think that is the state of the art, if you ask me. And that has to change. And the new education policy has outlined a number of problems that are the causes for this. So, and then now we have to see how these are implemented.
That some combination of extreme competition for vocational means after school and some deficiencies in the way the state provides education. These two things jointly combine to produce a situation where engagement with education is like almost non-existent by design. Where it happens, it's by accident, right? And that was certainly my experience in the sense I had some outstanding teachers throughout at all levels of my education. And the moments of insight and engagement that I remember from my education were because of these individuals. And they did it despite the constraints of the system. So that is exactly the kind of systemic reform that needs to make it less dependent on these extraordinary individuals. I was lucky to see them. Not every child might be.
We teach people disciplines they don't enjoy learning, and then they turn it into something else. So there are pros and cons to this. Of course, I don't mean to beat on the system.
Somebody mentioned that 85% of the brain development happens before the age of 6, and so one of the big things that the NEP has done is bring 3-year-olds into the fold of formal education. Now, many people will disagree with this because they'll say that kids are too young, but we were looking at the larger number of kids in rural India where parents have to go to work and so on, where they didn't have the time and the opportunity to stimulate their own kids. I think Suresh talked about parents' role in it. So we've provided the possibility that 3 to 6-year-olds will have some intellectual stimulation done for them. That's a big new chunk. The other thing to do is to discuss, is to remedy what has been discussed all this time, which is what's the interest of the child and how do we enable that. And in order to do that, we've done something at the secondary school, which is sort of remove the endless stress of 10th standard exams. Charu was generous enough to not talk about it, but it destroys everybody's lives, 10th standard and 12th standard exams. So we've said that the exams can be taken multiple times. It can be taken at different times of the year and in one subject at a time. You don't have to take all subjects, so that is now set aside. Given that you free up from the exams, then how do you enable a child to explore their interests? So we've sort of borrowed the liberal education concept and brought it down into secondary school level and said that, the child, apart from core subjects, the child will have a lot of choice, and that will include sports and arts and music and, all our amazing intangible cultural heritage that India has, and, also vocational education and so on, programming and whatever else you wanted to do. So that's what we've done. And then at the higher education level, we carry on with this, liberal education. Both Shri and Bhavesh mentioned that, they want to do things, and Shri wants to interact with other students and help them. And that's his way of finding fulfillment. And Bhavesh wants to solve real world problems. So these are becoming now the center of the way education will be done at the higher education level. And in order to in India after independence, we actually separated research institutes from universities, which was sort of the German model at that time. And there was the American model where universities did also teaching and research. So Germany moved into the US model in the 90s, but we're still continuing with the separation of research and education. So we've tried to fix that and say that, no, we must find funds to seed research in universities and colleges so that we can, many more students like Bhavesh can have the experiential learning experience. Now, only one last point I want to say before I hand over back to you, which is that the policy is too big, so I can't really summarize everything, but I just wanted to give you a sense of how we're trying to fix it. But one of the things that we have not discussed here today so far is the fact that we are talking primarily about IITs, ISERs, Indian Institute of Science. These are Government of India run institutions, which Government of India started. Of course, IIT started before because of the constitutional provision, but many ISERs and all have come after 1976, when Center also got a role in education, But most of the education, so for example, in higher education, 93% of enrollment is in state universities. And if I am sitting here today having worked on NEP, it's because I got the opportunity to go out to state universities and teach young men and women there. And what I found just refused to go away from my mind, which is that, these kids have language problems. They are very underconfident. They are afraid to ask questions, so it was not right. I was standing in the classroom and thinking something's wrong. I was trying to teach them technology subjects at the master's level, and I could see that, there were so many problems. So the state universities and colleges are in much worse shape than the IITs or the ISERs or the other educational institutions are. So the policy has thought very hard about, funding is a very important thing. We'd have to put much more money. Part of the problem in state universities is lack of resources and lack of funding, but also the amazing neglect of faculty. For a civilization that we claim, guru, we have such an important reverence for our gurus. We have done precious little for them over many decades. So they don't get trained well. I'll give you some numbers. In Karnataka, the state I'm in, 69% of college teachers and 50% of university teachers work on contracts 10 months a year, renewed annually. And the salary, a princely sum of 11,000 rupees a month if you don't have a PhD, and 13,000 rupees a month if you have a PhD. So it tells you everything you want to know. I mean, what is the root of our problem with the education system? So we've tried to make many recommendations with regard to preparation of faculty, their work conditions of work, their career progression, and so on. But it is entirely up to state governments and of course the central government, but they, like I told you, they handle the smaller number of students. It's really entirely up to the state governments how well they implement the policy. So the futures of our education depends on the political will to do the right things.
Is when you analyze what's missing in primary and secondary education around the world, a lot of the time what's missing is thinking. The focus is on remembering, because remembering suits a particular style of testing that goes, well, how will we know if education's been a success? Well, we'll ask them what they remember. And then if they remember it all, then education has been a success. And it's a gross simplification of education. And it's a failure to be able to understand how to assess and evaluate what learning has really taken place. Because remembering is not learning, and thinking is what we need to do. And this is all the way through the NEP document and so forth. That it talks about the need to move on from remembering to understanding. And this is absolutely the key to the process. What is it you find most difficult about school? And the pupil says, teachers. And the researcher says, why? He says, well, they're always interrupting. And the researcher says, they're not always interrupting. They're trying to help. They're trying to guide you and give you things, help you through it. And the child said, yes, but I've come to school to learn. How can I learn if they're teaching all the time? And I think this is the fundamental issue that we need to get across. And I think this is what the NEP is talking about, it's got to become about learning, not about teaching. And that your focus as a teacher in the classroom should always be on those young people. Are they learning? Or is it just that I'm teaching? And that's the most important thing.
So one of the remarkable things is I was reading the 1993-96 UNESCO publication, Learning the Treasure Within, by Jacques Delors, President of the EU Commission. And one of the committee members for that report was Dr. Karan Singh, who was our External Affairs Minister and I think key leader in many of the policy statements. And I was struck by the visionary perspectives position there. And I want to give you a flavor of that. And I want to use that framework for us to now consider as we look at our propositions here. They talked about tensions of global versus local, universal versus individual, tradition versus modernity, long-term versus short-term, competition versus equality, knowledge expansion versus human ability to absorb, between spiritual and material. So they understood in many ways the tensions that prevail in educational systems of those times, right, 50 years back. And they came out with 4 pillars: learning to be with autonomy, judgment, and responsibility; learning to know, learning as a lifetime proposition; learning to do, both mental and physical skilling; learning to live together with pluralism, collaboration, and understanding. So I thought that document itself actually was very well formed in terms of its thinking. But I come now to the things that we have discussed, the things we have heard. There are tensions similarly in the Indian educational system and maybe globally. There are tensions of affordability that we discussed in great detail, tensions of scarcity, of exclusivity, of structural bias, village versus the urban, language barriers preventing transmission of knowledge, an excessive tendency towards information technology at the which is punitive to other disciplines, teaching for the sake of teaching rather than the outcomes, not sufficiently learning centric, not sufficiently vocational education to enable the other skills that we need in society. So these are all the tensions that prevail. I've just listed them out, but there are probably more and deeper ones. Let's spend a few minutes on what are we solving at this kind of a framework, right? Rather than the specific, we are now abstracting to a higher level.
Is it possible to impart experiential, creative, vocational, all the other sorts of learnings and pedagogies we spoke about at a very low cost? And if nothing else, what Agastya has discovered is that indeed it is. In fact, it becomes even more interesting and exciting and memorable if you do it at a very low cost, because it's counterintuitive.
To me, actually, the key place next is head teachers and school directors. There is a huge amount that they can do within existing budgets and with all the terrible constraints that they are working under. If you can persuade them that there is a different way of doing things which is within their reach, and which will be appreciated. And unless we can persuade head teachers to take this on board, and as I say, I believe they could implement a lot of this without additional money within their own resources, if they understood it and were willing to do it, I think a lot could be made to happen quickly. And that's certainly my experience around the world.
I'm curious about one issue, whether around the world, and certainly in India, there's a right to education. Should this be framed as right to learning and all the departments be defined as departments of learning rather than education? Does the panel and the other people participating feel that there is that notional difference transforms it from top down to bottom up?
It's the word that we always come back to, and it's through the experience of creativity that we've ended up in learning, because we think that learning is a deeply creative process, and that whilst we'd spent a lot of time saying we want to nurture the creativity, is that we realized in the end what we really wanted to do was to deepen the learning, and the skills that you come with creativity are the skills to deepen learning.
Notion of learn anywhere, at school, at work, at home. Learn anything, flexible, modular, at will, hands-on, etc. Learn universally from around the world and collaboratively. Learn with goodwill towards people and the earth, and learn with enjoyment without stress. Do any of these pillars appeal to any of you?
Yes.
You want to debate any of them?
You might want to add, sorry, this is Ganu. You might want to add one of the fallacies of that inevitably creep in when you design an education system instead of a learning system, is that you are trying to design a system that is supposed to cater to a future demand, right? And what the Japanese proved in the 1970s is that all that is going to only result in a lot of useless inventory, right? So if you learn to learn, then you learn to create it as and when it is required. Now, there are things that you have to invest in education that are long-term value, producing fundamental knowledge. You can't just learn it. But in 80% of the occupations, if education gives you the tools for livelihood, in 88-90% of the occupations, what you need to learn in a job, you need to learn just ahead of the job, right? So if education is renamed and repurposed as a learning system, this kind of inventory building, useless inventory building, will not happen.
For in 30 years from now, the futures of education, where content is no more the key, facilitation is the teacher's role, and not thrusting content. All as it comes down, we'll automatically achieve this learning paradigm from a teaching or educating paradigm. And I think that is very, very important in the future. It's going to be more and more topical, as Ganu said. The problems of climate change or water or energy or whatever will start making people find local solutions which come from this learning to learn kind of things that we impart to our children.
I am optimistic for sure. But one thing that you mentioned and I would like to stress upon is the system of collaborative learning. So like very often in primary and secondary schools, we see that the system of collaborative learning is not promoted as it should be. And that is what something I think should be focused or should be the aim of primary and secondary education as such. Because so collaboration would mean that you are seeing one problem from different angles, and that would give a better understanding of the problem and also the idea as such.
Uh, collaborative, I mean, from collaborative learning, I want to go to collaborative topics. So all the topics should not be taught as differently. So for example, physics is not different than maths. They are just very interlinked. So maybe if we just give the students the insights, look, so here's how they are interlinked. They're not exactly different subjects.
I would say the summary from my side is that whatever we decide to do, whatever policies we make, implementing in the correct way is the key for ensuring success of the futures of education.
We have all the reports that we read talk about the fact that we have increasing economic and social inequalities, and the coming generations will have to deal with the consequences of that. And are we preparing them enough? Do we have the courage to discuss these things in class in a way that is fair to everybody, so that they know what both sides are? Some of these social science questions, or even sustainability or income inequalities, if we don't discuss that, we are leaving a world to our children, to Sai and her, people younger than her, to cope with it without much preparation. I would say that that's something that we need to think about.
It's been an honor and a privilege to be part of this panel. Thank you all for being so collaborative, so forthcoming, and so clear and crisp in your articulation. I particularly want to thank the young panelists. I think you bring us hope, you bring us clarity, and you show us a way forward. I would only urge upon you one thing, which is concurrently, as Gandhi said, be the change that you want to see in the world. So be active. Change happens because you want to have it happen and you are participative in the change. Being external to the change does not make change happen. So be there in the forefront, argue for your rights to learn, and I think the future is for you to create.